Alright, so let's continue with the lectures by going through chapter 7 on strategies for communicating change. Okay, so these are the topics that we'll cover for chapter 7 on an overview of the communication process and then the elements in terms of communication, in terms of language, power, gender, and then emotions as well. And then we'll go into the communication strategies, okay, especially when it comes to communicating change. And finally, on the media used for communicating change. Right, so for the overview of the process of communication, so the way change is communicated is important to the success of the change program, which is obvious. Right, so as already stressed out in the previous chapters, among the factors that will ensure the effectiveness of the change process is not just the leadership or the vision that you have planned, but also the way that the change process is communicated throughout the organization. And in some cases, not just the communication of change within the organization, but also outside the organization, because as discussed as well, the change process not only affects the organization, but in some situations or some cases, it will also affect those outside the organization. For example, obviously the consumers or the customers who you do business with or who interacts with your organization, your suppliers, right, and the general public as well, okay, or even the government itself. Okay, so they will also, in one way or another, or one form or another, might be affected by the change that you make. So communicating change is also important for those outside as well. So when it comes to the basic process of communication, so these are the processes stated there. So you have obviously the sender, okay, the person who is sending the message, okay, and then this usually in the organization would be the management or the leadership of the organization. So they are the ones who are going to convey the message of the change process to the rest of the organization. And sometimes the sender might be the heads of department who conveys the message from the leadership to the members of their respective departments and so on. So you always have the sender, the person with the message, who conveys the message to others. Okay, so that's the sender. And then you have receiver. So of course the person on the other side of the communication is those who receive the message. In this case, who receives the message with regards to the change process that will be carried out. And the receiver is, again, depending on the interaction. So the receiver might be the head of department who receives the message from the management, and the receiver is most commonly the employees in the organization who receives the message from either directly from the management, or they receive the message from the heads of department or their supervisors or whoever it is, okay, or their immediate employer and so on. Okay, so you have someone who sends message and receive message, and this is of course the most basic components of the communication process. And another obviously basic component is the message itself, right? So you have a receiver and sender, but there's no message, so they stand there looking at each other, not saying anything. So you have to have a message to be conveyed in order to have communication. So the message can be in the form of verbal message or non-verbal message. Right. So verbal, obviously, it's something that's spoken. The message is spoken by the sender, and the receiver will then listen to the verbal message from the sender. And the non-verbal message, usually in everyday context, will be things like the not the body language of the sender. It's when you have a communication between two sides, the sender receiver. So the receiver or the sender will just, sometimes they don't say anything, but they try to communicate something to the receiver by the way they look, okay, or their body language. Right? The way they stand, or the way they fold their arms and so on. So normally when you see someone doing that, it sends a message. If someone is impatient with you, or someone who is not happy with you, you can see them from their facial features, and then as I mentioned, their arms folded across their chest and so on, okay, or their cakap pinggang and sebagainya. So those are the non-verbal messages. Okay, and with regards to change process, I'm not sure what are the non-verbal, but most commonly it is those, I would say, those facial features and the body language of the sender. Okay, and whether it's verbal or non-verbal, it is to trigger meaning. So the verbal message conveyed by the sender, again, is to give meaning. In this case, the process of change. So they want to give the meaning in terms of the vision that they have to the receiver, whether it's the head of the department or directly to the employees. Okay, and then on the part of the receiver, then they should, when they receive the message, then they should try to understand the meaning as well behind the message being delivered by the sender. And the same way that when you have non-verbal communication, okay, so as mentioned just now, when now you have someone looking at their facial features or their body language, that will also convey a meaning, or has a meaning, okay, from the way that you look at someone, from the way that you stand, okay, and so on. So these messages are mainly, again, to trigger the meaning behind what is being communicated. And the next one is the feedback. So providing a response to the sender in order to see if the intended meaning was conveyed. So the feedback is given by the receiver. Okay, so usually the sender sends a message to the receiver, and the receiver will respond by giving feedback to the sender. Okay, so again, the most basic, the simplest form of feedback, you say yes, yes boss, or yes sir, yes ma'am, okay, I understand, okay, roger and out, and so on, noted. All those things are feedback. A very simple feedback that shows that you have understood the meaning conveyed in the message by the receiver. Okay, so that's the feedback. And the same applies to the other way around. If you don't understand the meaning behind the message, so the receiver can give feedback, by, again, verbally, by saying, I don't understand, okay, the message. Can you explain can you explain further? Okay, or I'm not clear on what you are saying, and so on. Those are feedback, and even non-verbal. So when the receiver gives you a blank stare, okay, ataupun dia tunjuk muka yang confused, muka blur, That's also feedback. Okay? To show the receiver, to show the sender that the meaning was not conveyed, or the message was not conveyed effectively. Okay, that's a feedback. And then the channel, okay, the medium through which the message was sent. So the medium here ranges from the common media channel, which is what do you call it, the face-to-face communication, okay, using word of mouth. Okay, so you are verbally communicating. That's the medium. And as I mentioned just now, you have the non-verbal channels, okay, through your body language, your facial expression, and so on. That is also regarded as a medium or a channel of communication. You also have those which you can probably categorize as a non-verbal, will be written communication. That's also a channel if you're writing. Right, so you write, or nowadays you type. Okay, so no one writes anymore. You send memos, okay, to the heads of department, or you send memos directly to the employees to convey your message. So those are also channels. Okay, and again, you have all these now modern channels of the internet, okay, through social media, okay, emails, and so on. Those are also channels in which communication or messages can be communicated. And then the next component is noise. So noise here refers to the distractions that exist in the communication environment and may act to interfere with the transmission of the meaning. So noise is not just the literal noise, like bunyi bising. You're trying to communicate your message to the receiver, but then there is a lot of noise around you, which can also affect the communication of your message, or as they say, the transmission of meaning. Noise can also be those other distractions, as mentioned there, example there, like using jargon words. Yeah, probably you already know what is jargon. Okay, you're using all these canggih words, right? Okay, so as management or as a leader, you probably will be more familiar with all these technical words or these sophisticated words. But when you use the same words and communicate your message to employees who might not be familiar with these concepts or words, then that will result in the meaning not being communicated effectively. And you will get that expression, as I mentioned just now, the muka blank, okay, muka confused, or they might just simply say directly to you, I don't know what you're talking about, right? So please use English, and so on. So again, using those jargons or technical and sophisticated words can also be categorized as noise. Okay, these are again factors that interferes with the effectiveness of the communication of your message. So overall, what you can see from this communication process is that it is a two-way process. Okay, so communication has to be a two-way process in order to be an effective communication. So if this communication is just one way, okay, only the sender gives the message and the receiver does not give feedback, or is not given the opportunity to give feedback, then that is not effective communication, okay, especially in the organizational environment, and even more importantly in the change process. So when you have to communicate change programs or change process in the organization, then communication has to be effective in the sense that when the sender communicates the message, the receiver has to give feedback. Okay? And the sender must give the opportunity for the receiver to give the feedback, okay, regarding the message, so that both sides can clarify that both sides are clear on the message that is being delivered, and both sides understand the meaning behind the message that is being communicated. So that is the two-way elements of a communication process. So there are many problems that can disturb or disrupt the process of communication. There are a lot more. If you look up other sources or references, but they just mentioned, I think, 3 here. First one is message overload. So this is when information acquisition is overbalanced compared to an individual's response capabilities. Right, in other words, you're being bombarded, you're being overloaded with the message being communicated to you by the sender. So when there is too much message being communicated, so it can result in a situation where the receiver is not able to give a response or give feedback. Okay, so there's too much. For example, the sender gives too many details or too many objectives, or a very long winding explanation about the change that's going to happen, or the sender communicates a lot of figures or numbers, data, statistics, and so on. So when the receiver receives all this, then they are not able to give a proper feedback because they're being, again, overloaded with too much information. So messages, in other words, what the moral here is, messages should be conveyed, as simple or straightforward as possible, and only provide the relevant information to your intended receiver. Next one is message distortion. This problem is when, or happens when, meanings are misinterpreted through intentional or unintentional problems relating to the sending or receiving of the message. Okay, so again, distorted. Okay, the message is distorted. What is distorted? Again, so the message is distorted. In this case, it means that the meaning behind the message is inaccurately interpreted. Okay. So the interpretation of the message is wrong or not accurate. And this happens when there are problems that can happen from either side, either from the sender or the receiver. Okay. So the problem in terms of how, for example, how the message was conveyed by the sender can cause message distortion. Okay, so the sender does not communicate the message properly, and as a result, the receiver will misinterpret the meaning behind the message. And for the receiver, okay, so the sender might have given or communicated the message properly or adequately, but the receiver, whether intentionally or unintentionally, so they might misinterpret the meaning. Okay? Probably, the employee or the receiver might not like the person who is sending the message. Okay, so they intentionally misinterpret the message. Or if the receiver was not focused, or they're not paying attention to what the sender was communicating, same thing as well, they can misinterpret. Okay, so they only hear a few bits and pieces of the information, and then they interpret it, okay, in that manner. Okay, so not the full message that's being interpreted, they only interpret only a few elements of the info. And as a result, they misinterpret the message. So this is what we call message distortion. And then message ambiguity. Okay, when an organization has a vision, but is not prescriptively clear on how to achieve it. So when we say ambiguous, okay, when a message is ambiguous, it is too general. Okay, there is no specifics, no specific details in terms of the message being communicated. So as mentioned there, when it comes to the change process, so the vision that has been formulated by the management or the leadership, it is, or it does not have any specific details on how they want to achieve the vision. They have a vision, but it's not clear how to achieve it. So when you present or communicate that message to the rest of the organization, then you'll have a problem where the receiver will not know what to do. Okay, so they receive your message. This is the vision that we have for our organization, but how are we going to achieve it? We have no idea. Okay, because your message is too general. Okay, they might have 2 or 3 options in terms of how to achieve the vision, and they are not clear in terms of which direction they should go in terms of achieving the vision. So that's a problem when you have message ambiguity. Okay, next topic we'll look at is the the factors or the elements involved in communication. Okay, so you have language, power, gender, and emotion. The first one is language, and this is the most basic, most common, most obvious component or element of communication. So the language reflects and reinforces underlying social and power relationships. Sorry. So how you use your language, okay, the words that you use when you communicate any message to the receiver. So when it comes to language, again, this is always a very, you can say complex, can be very tricky, because the words that you choose to use will often determine the effectiveness of your communication and will determine whether the message gets across to your receiver. And this is very important, especially when it comes to communicating change, because you have to make sure that the language you use is understood by the receiver so that they know what is the vision and they know what they have to do to achieve the vision. So leaders and managers have to make sure they use the correct and the proper language in communicating it to the receiver. Okay, so a simple example they give there, in terms of instructions, okay, to your receiver. So you can use when it comes to asking the receiver, to take a seat. Okay, so on the one side you can just say sit down, right? So with that exclamation mark, so that conveys a very harsh, very strong tone of language. And depending on who your receiver is, they will have, might have different reactions to it. And you compare that with simply just shouting "sit down" versus saying to your receiver that you look tired, or you must be tired. So why don't you sit down? Okay, why don't you have a seat? Okay. Or even just that magic word, please, right? Please have a seat, right? Or please sit down. So that shows the contrast between the language that you use, between a very I would say not really aggressive, but very harsh, sit down manner with please sit down, or please have a seat, or why don't you sit down. So language is again always important in terms of how you communicate as a sender and how the receiver will respond to your message. So that's one of the most important elements of communication. Next one is gender. So gender differences tend to affect the process of communication. So there are 3 examples given there, and again you can analyze yourself whether this is true or not. So when it comes to getting credit or taking credit, okay, for something, whether it's the success of a task or project or the success of the change process. So the example is that for the men, they tend to use I, meaning that in the singular form. So they take the credit for something. And for women, they tend to use we. Okay, so it's more of a collective. I say taking credit collectively. So in other words, the man says, when there is an achievement, they say, I did it. Okay? I achieved this. And women, they will say, we did it, or we succeeded, or we achieved this, and so on. Okay, so that is something that can affect. So when that is being communicated by the sender, whether it's the I achieve this or we achieve this, so the receiver will respond accordingly. Okay? So they might feel that you are not recognizing their role in the achievement, so the receiver might be offended. Okay, and if you were to say like we did a good job, or we succeeded in achieving this, then the receiver will more likely feel or respond positively by saying that they feel acknowledged, or their contribution was acknowledged in the communication. Okay, so that is the element of getting credit. Okay, and again, you can judge by yourself whether this is true or not. Number 2 is confidence and boasting. Okay, confidence and boasting. So example there, minimize doubt versus downplay certainty. All right, so they don't really give examples of who does what, whether it's the men or women and so on. But again, you can try and analyze based on your own experiences or your understanding. So communication is when it is conveyed with confidence, then the effect is that it helps to minimize doubt in the receiver. Okay, so the receiver, when they receive any messages with regards to change process, they might have doubts in terms of whether this will work or whether this will succeed. So if the message is communicated with confidence by the sender, again, this can be interrelated with those other elements like language. Okay? So you convey or communicate the message of change with a confident tone, with using confident language. Okay, so that you say like, I believe this can, okay, or we can benefit from change, and so on and so on. So you use those kind of confident words. And same thing with body language. Okay, so when you convey the message, you stand very stand firm, right? You don't slouch, or you don't move around, and so on. So that is a difference between confidence and lack of confidence in terms of your posture. So if that is communicated in that manner with confidence, then the receiver will see that you have the confidence, and their doubts will start to diminish. Keraguan, dia akan lama-kelamaan akan hilang. And they will also share your confidence in the message that you are communicating. And in contrast to boasting, I think we all know what boasting is. So usually boasting is when messages are communicated with exaggerated message. It is exaggerated or unrealistic, and so on. Okay, so you have a change vision, and then you communicate a change plan to your employees, and you say that, okay, we can be the next Apple, or we can be the next Grab, or be the next the next Shopee, whatever it is. Okay? Despite your company still being quite small or still starting out, but you already boasting about the changes you make that will supposedly make your company on level or even greater than the more established organizations. So this is what we call boasting. And very often, people get confused between confidence and boasting. Okay? And again, in terms of the words to use, and also the way that the channel that you use to communicate the message. Okay, so when messages are communicated in that manner, a boasting manner, then it often tends to downplay certainty. Okay, so confidence downplays doubt or minimizes doubt, and boasting will minimize certainty, kepastian. Okay, so when you boast, then the receiver will not really share your vision or your view regarding the message. So there is less certainty among the receiver in terms of whether the vision can be successful, whether it can be achieved or not. And again, because this is under gender, so they don't really mention who does more in terms of confidence or boasting. Is it the men who do more confidence and less boasting, or is it the women who communicate more in confidence rather than boasting? So we don't know. You can just figure it out yourself. Right? And thirdly, asking questions. Okay? Again, communication also involves not just to communicate a message, but also the message can be in the form of questions. Okay? So messages should be understood as not just statements. Satu kenyataan yang yang disampaikan kepada penerima. Okay? It's not a statement, not just a statement. Communication or messages can also come in the form of questions. Okay, like very simple example in our everyday communication. You see someone you ask them, how are you? Okay, apa khabar? Right. You don't see someone and then you say, you're doing fine. Hello, you're doing fine. You don't do that. You ask questions. How are you? Okay. Or you say, dah makan ke apa ke? You don't see someone, you say, you ate already. Alright. So that's how you communicate in the form of questions. And same thing with receiver. So the feedback also in the form of questions as well. Okay, not just a statement like, the receiver will say, I understand. Okay, yes, 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 boss, and so on. Baik tuan, sebagainya. So it can also be feedback in the form of questions like, what does this mean? Okay, can you explain more about this, please? I don't understand. Can you repeat what you said, and so on? Those are feedback in the form of questions. So in the case of asking questions in the context of gender, so it is said, and again you can analyze this by yourself, whether it's true or not, or accurate or not. But they say that women ask more questions than men. Or not ask more questions, so should be ask questions more. Okay, that's also different meaning. Okay, asking more questions meaning you ask too many questions. But ask questions more than men. Okay? So in the communication, whether the receiver, especially, okay, if it's a male, they will probably ask less questions. So when they receive a message, then they'll just accept. Okay, they just nod. Okay, I understand. Okay, fine. Okay, noted. Okay, and then they just get on with it. Okay, but women, they will probably ask questions more when they receive a message. All right. So is that true or not? Okay. I don't know. So what do you think about that? Okay. So I don't. Do you understand? Okay, so I'm asking questions more. Okay. So that is the element there of gender and communication. Okay, so some say it's true. Okay, so I'm not sure whether you agree with your friend or not. Okay. Do you agree or not? Okay. So that enough questions only. Okay. So that is the gender element when it comes to communication. Next one is power. So power, okay, so the font is very small. So managers can use 3 techniques to avoid these situations. Perspective taking. Okay, thinking about how others are likely to think and feel about change. Okay, so again, elements of power in terms of the power relations, in other words. Okay, so in organizations, you'll have, actually in any situation, when it comes to communication, you have power relations. Okay. So in the organization, between you and your superior or your boss, okay, at home, can be between you and your parents, and so for example, and all that. Or in school, last time here, between the student and the teacher and all that. So you have power relations in terms of the process of communication. So very often when it comes to power relations, when you have communication between 2 sides, in which one side, usually the sender, has more power than the receiver, then there tends to be how do you call that? Not really a problem, but can be an issue in terms of conveying the message. Okay, so sometimes people, when they are communicating with someone with power, then they are less likely to ask questions or less likely to give feedback to the sender. Okay? Because again, the perception that the person with power, you should not question what they are telling you, or you should not show any negative feedback and so on. So that can be a problem, and that will disrupt communication as well. So to avoid that, so managers and leaders as well need to use the technique of perspective taking. So those in the position of power need to think about how others are likely to feel and think about change. Okay, so how do you, as a leader or as a manager, how do you think? So you have to be able to predict, or at the very least anticipate, how your intended receiver will respond to the message of the change plan or change process that you are going to communicate. So that is something that managers need to be aware of. Next is threat reducing behavior. So engaging in intentional interpersonal interactions with staff to minimize their perception that changes are likely to lead to harm to them. Okay, so the threat reducing behavior, so the way that you communicate the change to the employees or to your staff should be done in a way that does not give them the impression that their jobs are under threat, okay, or their employment or their job security is under threat. Okay, so this again would require things like the confidence element we saw as well. Okay, so threat reduction can be done by communicating the change process with confidence, that you can assure them or reassure your staff that despite the changes that are going to be made, no harm will come to them in terms of their job, in terms of their livelihood, and so on. Okay, so managers would need to use this method as well. And number 3, reflection. So self-evaluation of the actions to lessen the emergence of negative emotions and identification of corrective actions when necessary. So managers often need to reflect on the way they communicate or how they communicated to the receiver. So if they had communicated the message, in this case the message of change, in a manner that resulted in negative response, so the managers have to do a self-reflection, a self-evaluation, or to re-evaluate the way they communicate their message. Okay. Try to find out in what way that they communicated that resulted in that negative response. Is it the way that the language they use, or was it presented in a way that showed lack of confidence on your part? Okay, so they have to do that reflection, and following that, proceed with corrective action. So if you are able to identify the cause of your communication resulting in a negative feedback or negative response, then the managers have to then carry out the corrective actions, okay, to settle whatever miscommunication or settle whatever misinterpretation that resulted in the negative feedback. Okay, so they can go to the person who had that negative response and as they say, clear the air, right? To clarify what they had meant, what they said, okay? And then to give the correct meaning behind their message, okay, in the hopes that this will again rectify that situation. Right, so that's the communication and the power and communication. And the last element is the emotion. Okay, so emotion is linked to change and can also contribute to the breakdown of communication. So individuals can perceive that organizational change can harm them personally, thus the emotional state and sense of identity are threatened by a change situation. So emotions, when it comes to communication, again, as mentioned before this, it is a two-way. So emotions on the part of the sender and emotions on the part of the receiver. But in the context of communicating change, the emotions are more connected to the receiver. Yeah, those who receive the message change, because they are the ones who are going to be affected by the change. So the sender would need to be able to read the emotions of the receiver when they communicate any change plans or communicate the change process to the receiver. So they will need to study about all these different emotions. Okay, whether they study all these emoticons that they have and so on, or they read up on psychological books and so on. So they need to be able to see the response or feedback, the non-verbal feedback of the receiver when they communicate the message of change, okay? Especially if the change was to have an effect on the receiver's position or status in the organization. Okay, so depending on their emotions, then the sender will have to react accordingly. So if they communicate the message of change and the receiver shows a very happy face, okay, they're smiling, okay, and so on, so most likely they understand the message and they're okay with the message and they are okay with the change plan. Okay, and then again, based on the other emotions, whether they are angry and so on, then the sender has to identify why they became angry because from the message and do the corrective action. Okay, probably they did not understand your message or the message, or they had misinterpreted the message and so on. So make the corrective action based on that emotion. All right, so let's proceed with the fourth topic on communication strategies. So you have more or less these two issues. So the first one is, can you communicate too much? Okay, so too much communication also not a good thing. So as we've seen in the previous topics, that you have this what was it again? The message overload. Okay, so the participants, meaning the receiver especially, may suffer from that, a message overload or information overload, if you communicate too much information to the intended receiver. And too much communication usually implies that there's no real participation in the communication, meaning that communication is not a two-way process, as I mentioned earlier on. Right? So for effective communication, there should be a two-way interaction between both sender and receiver. So the sender gives the message and the receiver will respond by giving feedback. So in a situation when there is too much communication, then very often the receiver will not have that opportunity to give their feedback or their response. And again, this may be due or partly due to that message overload. Okay, so there's too much information for them to process, so they don't know exactly how to respond to that message. And the other element is getting word out or getting buy-in. So this differentiates between providing information or gaining participation in the process. So when you say getting word out, so it's very similar to that one-way communication. So you are only communicating your message or conveying your message to the receiver, and that's it. Okay? There's no feedback, or there is no, or the sender does not give the opportunity for feedback to the sender. So once the sender has communicated his or her message, then they walk away after that. Okay, dia terus belah, okay, tanpa beri peluang pada penerima untuk memberi maklum balas, okay, ataupun beri respon pada sender. That's what I mean by getting the word out. And getting buy-in is then when that is where the communication attempts to gain the participation of the receiver in the communication process. Right? So you, as a sender, you convey your message, you give your message to the receiver, and then you wait for that response or feedback to know whether the receiver had understood the message or the meaning of the message that you have communicated. Okay, that's what we call the getting buy-in. So the communication strategies. So you have this communication continuum, includes these 5 approaches. So you have, first one is known as the spray and pray. So employees are sprayed with wide variety of information, and managers pray that the staff will pick up on what is needed to be done. Right? So the spray and pray, you just communicate the message, and you hope and pray that the receiver, in this case the staff, will understand or will know what they need to do, or you pray that that the employees understood the message or the meaning behind the message. Next one is tell and sell. So managers tell staff about changes and sell them on why they are required. So the tell, I think, is very obvious, straightforward. You're just communicating the message of change to the staff. The sell, in terms of convincing the employees or the staff. So when you say tell and sell, is to convey and convince, more or less. Right? You convey the message and you have to convince the employees why the change is needed, why it's important, the significance of the change. So that's what you call the tell and sell approach. Underscore and explore. Management, I say, engages employees in a dialogue about the change process and explore potential obstacles and misunderstandings that need to be addressed. So this is the approach where you tend to have more participation from the receiver. So the management, or in this case the sender, they will convey or communicate the change plan or change process to the employees, and they will have a dialogue. It is a more extensive form of communication. So you have a back and forth communication. The sender communicates the message, receiver gives their feedback or response, and then the sender will then respond accordingly, and then they go back and forth. Okay, that's dialogue. So they have this active dialogue about the change process that was communicated by the management. And from there, both sides will explore the potential challenges or obstacles or any misunderstandings that might have occurred in the process of communicating change. So it's a very, as they say, fruitful communication in the underscore and explore. Identify and reply. So this approach is where you identify employees, rumors, and reply to it. So it is an attempt to help staff make sense out of issues that are confusing them. So this approach requires the management to identify those rumors or unverified information regarding the change plan or the vision or change process, and reply to those rumors or to reply to those unverified information that is circulating around the organization. And again, I think we just in the previous chapter we talked about how rumors can lead to resistance to change, because these are guesses or unverified facts that will influence the reaction of the employees towards change. And very often rumors will result in resistance. So to avoid that from happening, so as soon as management or the leadership in the organization are aware of any rumors that's going around regarding the change process, so they'll have to quickly respond or reply to it. And that's also a form of communication when you respond to any rumors that is going on. Okay, so you're communicating the facts. Okay, you are communicating the real information or the true information that the employees needs to understand, so that this will help make things clearer and resolve any confusion, and to avoid that resistance to change. And the fifth approach is withhold and uphold. So the information is withheld until it is necessary to be released. The management adopts a party line on issues that they uphold publicly. So basically, it's just simply you are withholding information until the right time. So sometimes communication or messages, right? Messages, they don't really need to be conveyed quickly, and they don't need to be conveyed. Not all communications must be done immediately. In other words, so there are certain information that needs to be withheld to a certain time. Only then the management will inform or communicate to the rest of the organization. So it depends on the management itself, what information that should be communicated immediately and what information that should be withheld from the employees until a certain time. And that is the what we call the party line there. Okay, so it has to be upheld. That kind of approach needs to be upheld, and the employees must also be aware or made to be aware of that approach that certain information will not be released until a certain time. So even that must also be communicated to the employees so that they don't feel that you are keeping secrets from them. Right? But you tell them straight away that, okay, this information we cannot tell you now. It will be communicated at a particular time. So at least that will ensure your employees know that you are not keeping secrets from them, and that you show that it gives the perception of the importance of that information that you are withholding. So it also helps to keep the employees on their feet as well, okay? Because they want to know what the information that you are going to release later on. Okay, and this is just further information or additional information, okay, from those 5 approaches or the strategies for communication. So next is the contingency approaches to communicating strategy, which varies or which is different, okay, depending on the type of change. And again, contingency, meaning that you have to adjust your approach according to that situation. That's contingency, which I think was mentioned in the previous chapters, when you like the situation of if, then. Right? If this happens, then this is the approach or strategy that we have to take. So when it comes to developmental or incremental type of change, so the best approach to communicate the change is face-to-face and aim for widespread involvement, meaning you get the whole organization, if possible, or the majority of the employees to be involved in the discussion for change. Right? So for that kind of change, developmental or incremental change. For task-focused change, so a top-down communication. Okay, so top-down meaning that from the management that flows all the way down to the middle managers, okay, the heads of department, and so on. And from the middle managers, they flow down to the employees. So top-down approach in terms of communication. And this involves more formal medium or channels, such as the memos, right, the official company emails, and so on. So that is how the message will be communicated down to the employees, okay, when the changes involve tasks, okay, the tasks that are done to bring about change. So that will be done through the top-down and through formal channels. Charismatic. So this is a more personalized form that seeks to gain emotional commitment. Okay, so change that requires charismatic communication. So like in the chapters previously on the leadership and so on. So to ensure that your employees are, I say, willing, right? The readiness and or the willingness of the employees to carry out the change. So sometimes it requires a charismatic approach. And it requires the management or the leader to be able to use their charisma to communicate the message of change so that the employees can accept and they are ready to carry out those changes. So obviously this requires some skills, okay, for managers who are not naturally charismatic. So they have to learn how to communicate charismatically okay, in order to get the message across to their employees. So the elements like confidence will be among the common traits or characteristics for charismatic leadership as well as communication. Okay? So you often see those organizational leaders, those very charismatic leaders. So they communicate in a very confident manner, and as well as the use of their language and their body language as well. Okay? So those are things that can help with the charismatic approach. Turnaround, so formal, top-down, usually during crisis to force people to comply. Right, so turnaround is basically when you have certain problems being faced by the organization, market downturn or a loss in terms of profits, for example, a loss of consumer base or a decline in consumer base and consumer loyalty. So whatever crisis that requires change, so this will require more formal communication as well as top-down as well. Okay, from the management flowing down to the employees. Okay, so it's more or less similar to the task focus, right? So you need a more formal approach to convey your message in the time of crisis, because this is something that is a challenge for the organization and it requires more formal approach in terms of communicating a message on how we should make changes to deal with the problem or the crisis that the organization is facing. So the contingency approach to communication strategies, okay, so the type of change, the stage of change, and the leadership style. Okay, so the developmental change or type of change is where you have the planning, usually involves the planning stage of change. Okay, so it's the planning process. So you require a commanding leadership style, okay, where the leadership or the management, have the, as mentioned in the previous slide, you have more face-to-face communication, okay, where you can easily display your command, your power relations as well with your employees, and you can be more involved in the discussions with the employees when you are planning the change. So it requires a much more, more involved role of the management or the leadership. And then the task focus type of change, okay, this is the enabling stage of change, and it requires the logical style of leadership. Okay, so again, when you have tasks, it means you have processes and procedures, so you must follow the logical flow. In the same way that tasks must be implemented following a logical process, so the communication must also follow a logical process of conveying message, in this case the top-down approach, and by using more formal channels. And then the charismatic type of change, okay, this is the launching stage, okay, of change, and also the catalyzing stage, right? So you have to be a catalyst, meaning you have to be able to motivate the employees, okay, when it comes to change, and that is where you require inspirational leadership. Okay, you're able to inspire, able to motivate, right, your employees and encourage them okay, to carry out the change. And for the turnaround, change is the maintaining stage. So you try to maintain the organization in the face of problems or crisis and so on. So this requires the supportive leadership. Okay, so again, we have problems or crisis, then employees. So leadership has to understand that in times of problems or crisis, then employees will be under a lot of pressure. They'll be under a lot of stress. So management has to be taking on a more supportive role or supportive leadership style. Okay. So you give them that support in the form of that more formal approach. Right? So the formal approach means that, as mentioned there, the top-down and formal channel, so that the message can be communicated across the organization. Okay, when you use a more top-down approach, so the messages that flow from the management or come from the management will flow down to the middle managers, and then from there the message will then spread out, okay, throughout the organization. So every employee will receive that same message in the hopes that this will give them that support to face the crisis or problem that is going on. Okay, and the last one is the communication media. So the media that is to be used to communicate the message, okay, between the sender to the receiver, it varies in richness depending on how personal it is, or personal is its ability to communicate change. So there is a hierarchy of media richness that can be more applicable for particular situations. Not sure which book they are referring to for that page 1, but the example given there, an email or memo is less personal and therefore less rich than a face-to-face meeting. Right? So the richness that they're trying to convey here, more or less in terms of, you can say the impact, how impactful is the medium or the media you are using for communication. So get emails or memos, any written or typed form of communication is less rich because it is less personal. You don't see the person who is sending you the message, and you cannot see the person to whom you are giving feedback to. Okay? So there's less interpersonal interaction when it comes to this kind of media, okay, of emails and memos or text and so on. So different media type, different types of media may also be more appropriate for different audiences with differing needs. Okay, so the management or leadership has to be able to assess, identify which media to be used for which target or which receiver, right? And also having to understand the needs of the receiver when choosing the proper media. So you can see there, in terms of the scale in terms of the effectiveness of communication, from least effective to most effective. And then you have these types of media. And then the other variables, as we call them, the distance. Okay, in terms of the distance between the sender and the receiver, and persistence required, meaning how often you need to communicate the message to your receiver, depending on that choice of media. So according to this, detailed documentation is the least effective way of communicating the message, and that is where you might have that information or message overload from your receiver, because the documentation that you have provided to the receiver contains detailed information, and very often too much detailed information, some which might not be relevant to the receiver, and that's why you have that message overload. So that can result in less effective communication. But for detailed documentation, it will be more suitable, if the sender and receiver are geographically distant, meaning they are quite far away. So you might be a manager and you want to send or to convey your message to someone in another branch, for example, of your organization, or a branch in another country even. So you have to send more detailed documentation. So obviously you cannot be able to do face-to-face. It will take too long to communicate that message. So you need to use more detailed documentation. And then for audio recordings, again, not that effective. Same thing with video recordings, because again, there is no ability for the receiver to give feedback, because they are watching a recorded message. Okay. So nak bagi feedback pun dia cakap dengan recording, which sounds quite silly. Okay, so you communicate through video recordings, and again, this is also more appropriate when sender and receiver are quite far from each other. And then overview documentation. Okay, so this same, not same, but it's the less detailed documentation. So the overview only contains the main points or summaries of the information that you want to communicate to the receiver. So it'll be a bit more effective compared to detailed documentation, and again, still more suitable when sender receiver are quite far from each other. Digital snapshots. So again, you're sending only photos to convey the message. So the photos of the building site that you want to send to your contractor or to your supervisor. Okay. And then again, it's a bit difficult to get immediate feedback. Okay. And again, this is also suitable for long distance sender receiver location. Email, online chat, conversations. Okay, same thing with phone conversations and video conferencing. So these are all more effective compared to the previous media, because this allows for direct communication, although through the use of this technology, but it enables participation and enables the feedback. Okay. And direct feedback as well. But it's also more suitable if the sender and receiver are geographically distant, or they are far from each other. And then for the face-to-face conversations or face-to-face around shared caching environment, I'm not sure what that means, but more or less it's face-to-face. Okay, so both sender and receiver are physically in the same area. And that's what they mean by co-located, so they're in the same building, okay, or the same office and so on. So this is where they can have face-to-face communication, and this is the most effective. Because you have all those elements involved in your communication, your language, emotions, body language, and so on. And you have the ability for the feedback and response. Okay? And you can see the feedback and you can see the emotions as they occur in a face-to-face communication. So this is the most effective form of communication. And when it comes to persistence, okay, so again, for the detailed documentation all the way to email, online, chat, conversation, so you can be very persistent, meaning you have to keep repeating or have to keep reiterating your message so that it does not get lost in the communication process. Because again, you have all these words, typed words in the online chat, email, you have pictures which require a bit explanations, and also documents which are full of words and so on. So you have to, the sender has to make sure they are constantly reiterating or stressing or pointing out the main message if they use this kind of media, right? But when you have phone conversations, video conversing, face-to-face, then you don't need to constantly hammer out the message, because you can always tell them directly, face-to-face, probably just once at the beginning of your conversation, so they already know what is your message, and then probably at the end of the conversation, you just give one quick reminder, and that's that. So, tak perlu nak ulang banyak kali message yang nak disampaikan. Okay, and lastly, the responsibility when it comes to communication media. So you have the CEO. So many believe that the CEO should be the principal communicator of change, while others find lower level managers more trusted by employees and therefore in a better position to communicate change. And this is very common as well in organizations. So some view that some employees find that they communicate better with their immediate superiors, like the heads of department or their supervisor or whoever it is at their immediate, immediate boss, as they call it, and they find it less, or they find it more difficult, to communicate directly with the CEO. So again, probably one of the factors is the power, right? The power play going on. So the perception that CEOs are very important people, and they have problems trying to communicate with those in that position of power. And also another factor is that the what do you call that? What's that word again? So we say kekerapan, berlakunya komunikasi antara pekerja dengan CEO is also less what's that word? Less kerap lah. Okay. So employees tend to communicate more frequently. Sorry, just remember frequency. The frequency of the communication. So employees, they communicate less frequently with CEOs, and that's why they don't feel, or they don't feel that they can get effective communication with CEOs. Whereas with their immediate supervisors or immediate superiors, again, their head of department or supervisor and so on, they interact more with them, and that's why they feel that they can they are in a much better position to communicate the change. So therefore, any changes that need to be made needs to be communicated from the CEO or the management down to the head of department or the middle managers, and then those managers will communicate the change directly to their respective employees. So that's how they feel that it's a better way to communicate change. And then you have the tag teams, not the wrestling one. Many organizations now use tag teams, so a transition management team. So the role of this team is specifically to stimulate open conversations through organizational units and dispersing information. So in other words, communication or the message is communicated by a committee. Okay, so probably in the example they're using here is what we're using in UiTM. So we have this OBE committee, the outcome-based education. So hopefully you are already familiar with that concept that we're using. Okay, so the outcome-based education committee. So they will convey, the changes that lecturers, for example, would need to carry out in terms of the approach to teaching learning, or changes in the way that they report the effectiveness of the teaching and learning. So now every semester, at the end of the semester, we have to do this report on the outcome-based education, based on, among other things, the results of the students, the grade they got, how many got A plus, A minuses, B plus, and so on. And then also based on your SUFO feedback, your entrance exit survey feedback, all those things must need to be compiled. So those were the changes that were done several years ago. So that will be the job of the OBE committee to communicate that message or that change to the rest of the academic staff. Okay, so they use this, what they call tag, that concept they use as known as tag teams. Right? And besides communicating, they also will encourage that participation or the dialogue between that committee and the receiver, in this case, the lecturers. So we can also give our feedback to the committee or the OB committee with regards to that change in terms of reporting the outcome-based education approach, right, in the university. And same thing applies to any committee that you have in the organization. They will communicate the change, and then the employees will then communicate the feedback to the committee members. That's what we call the tag team. Right, so that's the end of chapter 7 on communicating strategies for communicating change.